Welcome to another Varn blog Regrettable Century collab. This was kind of unplanned. Jason and I were actually going to do a Boundless and Bottomless today, but one of our colleagues couldn't make it, so we are recording a response to the general political milieu of the world.
It's kind of unplanned, but we planned it like, I don't know, 5 minutes ago.
Yeah.
Or so. Yeah.
And I'm calling this series kind of a subset of our From Dawn to Decadence series, and who knows when it'll happen. It'll happen whenever one of the Regrettable brothers and I have a few minutes of bullshit. But and we're gonna call this Doom 2024. Because that's the kind of mood I'm in. And while I am not embracing total political nihilism, and I know people need to like kind of understand that a bit. I think a lot of times people think I'm just pessimistic. I don't know. Jason, have you ever been vindicated and shocked that maybe that you were not even like cynical enough? Because watching the political events of the last week, Jamal Bowman losing in New York, which was obvious that it was going to happen, and yet there was this whole kerfuffle over a Palestine activist group protesting him, and they didn't even say not to vote for him. They just wanted him to not endorse Biden, to state for the record that anti-Zionism is not anti-Semitism, because somehow that's a pseudo-controversy that's being ginned up right now in universities. And what else did they want him to do? And take a stronger stance, I think, formally and endorse a ceasefire. You know, like not a whole lot. It wasn't a big ask. Our social democratic friends at Left Reckoning and whatnot were very upset about this. And my point the entire week was, one, Jamal Bowman's problems isn't the DSA and some Palestinian protesters protesting him, even though, yes, there's an AIPAC approved candidate, Latimer, who won, and is going to be more Zionist than Bowman. And yes, there is some truth to the fact that Bowman, while he has been a problem on this issue, has actually moved from J Street to slightly pro-Palestinian. He's, you know, not even to Rashida Tlaib's level, but more than most of the Congress and most of the Democratic Party, sure.
Well, yeah, like he's shifted enough to at least indicate that he knows about Twitter, so he knows that people are saying things about him.
Right. And I think also liberal Zionism is effectively dead. Like,
right.
I mean, you know, we have some friends over at Sublation Magazine who want to keep it around, I guess. But like, other than that, or at least that's part of the dialogue.
Yeah.
It really doesn't exist that much anymore. So there's that. But I mean, I'm sure that Bowman's inconsistency on those issues did not help him. But let's be honest, he didn't lose because of Palestine. Like, he lost because he's actually a pretty bad retail politician.
Right.
Like,
the Palestine stuff is really just like, what do you say, icing on the cake or gravy or whatever. It's like, it's just extra.
Right.
But it really was not enough to make or break his candidacy.
Right. The thing that made it clear to me is I watched the protest at the rally that Bernie and AOC spoke at for him. And looked like there was probably 200 to 300 people. So a few hundred people, including the protesters, which also wasn't huge. There may have been like 50 of them from what you could see. Now, there may have been more that we didn't see on camera, but still. It was shockingly low attended for, you know, a metro area that has several million people in it.
Well,
and
yeah,
that's like Bernie and AOC being there.
Right? I was going to say, even people who don't like Bowman at all, seems like they would have turned out just to see AOC speak or just to see Sanders speak. The fact that it wasn't 7,000 people is it's pretty shocking, actually.
But that was a tempest in a teacup compared to the next day, which was the presidential debate, which may be one of the only eventful presidential debates because it makes how uneventful presidential debates really are really fucking obvious. So Biden looked lost, confused. Trump looked slowed down and anemic, but
Dude, it was sad. It was like, it wasn't even funny.
no.
Like, there were some funny moments, but mostly it was just like, you know, all this talk about Biden being so slow and so senile, it really just like bummed me out. It's like, I think elder abuse is the term. It just, his whole staff should be in jail, or they should at least be fired.
Well, the thing is, they set the terms for this.
Yeah.
Like, they set the terms, they agreed to the terms and set a lot of the terms for how this debate would go down, bypassing the Presidential Debate Commission, which itself was created to bypass the League of Women Voters who did the debate, before the 90s. Like, the entire bourgeois institutionalization of this has been kind of astounding. And immediately people are like, well, maybe they're having this for the convention so we can drum up some opposition to Biden to run the convention. But they've changed the rules to make that very difficult this late in the game over the past 20 years. So unless the Democratic Party really wants to go full throttle against the nominal leader of the party,
which I don't think they're going to do.
No.
It doesn't seem, it's not just that it's not likely, there's no evidence that anyone's even trying to do that.
It was just clearly cope, right?
Yeah.
So the question for me becomes, the Biden team and the Trump team set up the terms. This made neither one of them look good, but it definitely worked better for Trump because Trump could stay while he was lying out of his ass, and he was even for Trump.
But he was also like restrained, like
he was restrained.
He didn't pounce on Biden the whole time. Yeah,
he would. Well, because he probably would have looked bad.
Well,
like he made some snarky remarks, but they were subdued compared to like prior performances.
Well, and they were within his time allotted to speak. So like it's weird that he didn't like speak out of turn even once, and he's just like let Biden crash and burn all on his own. Oh well, that would explain.
But still, he looked like a normal retail politician, a slow one, but he was cogent. And then, I was talking to Ben Burgess about this because Ben asked me to do a live recap, which I got shit for. Everyone thinks that because I hang out with Ben Burgess that I'm secretly somehow a social democrat or just a Democrat now. It's kind of funny. It's funny how people think that the one or two people you hang out with somehow defines your politics, when I'm also arguing with like Ben's allies on Twitter half the time. But
also just like if you pay attention to anything you ever said, any one thing ever, it's really obvious you're not you are of a different ilk, a different sort, a different set, whatever.
Yeah, I mean, to talk about it a little bit, Ben likes to say that we agree, and I do think actually Ben in some ways downplays some of the radicalness of his positions, but we don't agree. I just see him on the spectrum of acceptable politics. Like I would see him as an ally on my side. But at the same time, I do think this entire social democratic turn has actually ended up radicalizing people, but not in a helpful way. And I know maybe that's like me and you, we just, everyone's go, oh, you always sound so negative, but I'm like, yeah, but it's not
also like, everything is always really bad.
Right. And it's not like this, like internet Marxist-Leninism is leading to a resurgence of Marxist-Leninist institutions led by competent people who, the one exception to that is the PSL, and the PSL is both at this point legacy. It's not, its origins aren't Marxist-Leninist anyway. And it really seems to do well in protest periods, but the moment that this stuff is settled one way or the other, they're not going to be able to use it in the same way. We've seen this before because this was the same strategy adopted by the PSL during the Bush administration when they came into being in the first place. So,
yeah,
and a lot of people in the PSL seeming leadership, and I don't know who's on the central committee right now, but like they have, there are millionaires in that group, and so they have money because they have private back money within the organization itself. They don't release their dues numbers, but given how much that it's not really easy to join, I highly doubt they're more than 7,000 people. But they are in major cities, and they're very targeted about that, and they actually show up to demos.
I would be surprised if they were even 7,000 people.
Well, I mean, for the longest time, we thought the ISO was 5,000 people, and by the time it died, it was 1,000, and everybody was apparently projecting past numbers from the late 90s onto it because that's when it grew, and that was the image we had of it in our head.
Yeah.
A lot of these organizations are small. Go ahead.
I remember at one point, it's very early on whenever I joined, but we were like very proud of topping 1,000 again because our numbers had dipped below that for a while. Then they had risen pretty dramatically, but still, it's like I think that we tend to assume a lot more about these groups than we should. Like I think the Socialist Workers Party, I think there were there were 75 people last I checked, and that's just in the whole group.
And they had presses and everything else. And I mean, similar today, these organizations are actually easier to do. It's easy to set up a newsletter. Yeah. It's easy to get a massive following on Twitter, particularly if you're willing to use explicit bots. But hell, you don't even have to use bots anymore. Like to buy them explicitly, you get them anyway.
Right.
Like, I think so I came back to Twitter a little under a month ago, and I think I probably have 100 bots on my wall, like easily. And they're not, it's not hard to see them anymore. Like, it's just like, you click on it, it's like no tweets and something about OnlyFans or something, in the byline. And you're like, well, shit, like none of these numbers mean anything. So
I guess I shouldn't be surprised.
No, all this stuff. I mean, the thing is, Twitter was always overblown. Like, it's never had the user base that people have projected upon it. It's just its user base at one point was mostly media professionals and whatnot. Now it's, politicos, and a lot of them are writing media waves, and some of them have millions of followers, but you have no idea where they're coming from, how sincere the engagement is, or the hate following, etc.
Right.
All this stuff has gotten more opaque as social media has gotten more monetized and got more censorious. And so, and we've gone through one of the things that I think has happened that's led to a lot of weird hybrid ideologies is people being able to maintain positions that might get you banned on some of these social networks otherwise. So if you have a hybrid position, it's easy to stay on. So it's leading and I think I don't think that's all cynical either. I think there's something organic about that, but we have to admit that a lot of the Marxism that we see right now is vibes. I mean, people taking really strong stances on Stalin at this point.
Yeah, I gotta be honest. I kind of feel like even the majority, I don't want to say most, but maybe a slight majority is vibes. It's like it's air. It's meaningless. It's not based on anything at all other than just the way that people feel in a moment. So that vibes is the perfect word for it.
Well, we have to ask ourselves how this came to be. COVID played a role.
Oh yeah, certainly.
But in almost all cases when I mention this, such on child literacy or this, that, or the other, and these trends have been going on, that they start actually, some of them start as early as the end of the Obama administration. And they accelerate during the Trump administration. And then they go off the fucking rails after COVID.
Well, yeah, because COVID all COVID really did was just made a general tendency that was rising. It just made it dominant. But that it prefigured that it wasn't created by that isolation. It was fed and it grew to alarming lengths. So where did it come from though? Because I kind of just think this is all just downstream of being ineffective for a very, very long time. Just being an ineffective protest movement which is increasingly online. So maybe it started with like, I don't know, fucking LiveJournal and then MySpace and then Facebook, and it just kept spiraling out of control, kept rolling or whatever.
Well, what's interesting is a lot of these people complained about like the cancel culture wars, which was also started primarily online, right?
Yeah.
And they hooked up with weird things. I mean, Me Too. We always talk about Me Too and BLM as if they're the same thing, and we forget that BLM both times emerged as a hashtag movement that later became hundreds of different unaccountable codified organizations.
Right.
I
think the first time that I heard BLM, it was during the Trayvon Martin moment.
It was after Trayvon Martin, when there was another killing in a suburb of, again, a Midwestern industrial area. And then there was another killing in New York around what's his name? Eric Gardner.
Oh yeah, that's right.
So you'd had Trayvon Martin, you had two more high profile urban killings. One, and it did the thing that I've now noticed as a pattern. It was really codified as the aughts pattern and the aught teens pattern, is you had riots emerge organically amongst working class black people. There's also a killing in Maryland where a mixed race group of cops like let a kid die in a van.
Oh yeah, I vaguely remember that too.
Yeah. So that led to a series of riots, but by 2016, BLM was being used by professional activists to move in on the college campuses and talk about things like diversifying the police, creating more diverse elite. So you had an internal to the black community recuperation, right? But what was interesting about the Floyd uprising, and I'm going to say uprising because I have no idea. I've called it an insurrection, but it's not. It wasn't quite at that level. But it wasn't just a protest or a riot either. It was somewhere. We'll just say uprising.
I think uprising that indicates that it was spontaneous and disorganized, but more than just blind rage. It was like there were intentions, but they weren't all meshed together. So yeah, right. Uprising works.
But again, and this is a little different. So you had two patterns that we saw. We saw a pushback by an establishment of color against the ultra radicalism often adopted by people who were in mixed race groups. So they blamed white people for accelerating it. That was one thing. Right. Then we saw organic dual power prefigurative movements coming out of this during the actual riots and for the couple weeks after. Then the incident at Kenosha happened. And there was also many deaths. I mean, I think we don't talk about that there was people killed, multiple people killed by, quote, both sides of this debate during the Floyd uprisings. But what did we get out of it? You saw an intensification of ad hoc radical rhetoric, but in a weird way. You almost had a reverse Monte Bailey, where people were hiding relatively popular reforms in really isolating language.
Yeah.
Like defund the police, which one is a kind of milquetoastization of abolish the police. But two, what they really wanted was like something like more social welfare and community policing, which would be popular. Yeah. So why do it that way? And that wasn't the only time we saw that. Like abolish ICE was one of these things, right? But all that's gone now. Like it's a strategy that got buried very quickly. And today, Chevron deference has happened. So the ambiguities about the administrative state. So in the past, if there's been ambiguities in legislation, those ambiguities have been from a Reagan era decision made by a relatively conservative court, handled by the administrative agencies themselves. Now, the Democrats right now are framing this as an attack on democracy. It is an attack on the efficiency of government, but here's the problem. The administrative agencies in the executive branches are themselves unelected. They are themselves unaccountable. And a lot of the neoliberalization that was run through in the deregulation and regulated capture period from the Reagan and Bush administrations up to Bush 2 was done under Chevron deference. So people defending the administrative state so that Democrats can do this, because one of the long delay trends that people haven't been looking at is since about 1950 and the joining of the UN, you have seen legislative power increasingly moved to the executive branch by the legislature itself. Then when there's oversteps on that, they try to pull it back by creating new rules, but the new rules actually codify and reify the prior framework. So we can think about the Police Powers Act, for example. Like, the Police Powers Act limited the president's ability to do policing under UN treaty obligations and moved that away from Congress. But since the Police Powers Act and since Vietnam and since the joining of the UN, we have not actually declared a fucking war ever.
Yeah, like okay, so why is that? Because it makes me think that it's almost as though the legislature is like unconscious of what it's doing, and maybe that's the case most of the time. But
I don't think this was intentional. But let's talk about the incentive structure here.
Okay, yeah.
When you make hard decisions about war and peace, particularly going up to Vietnam, that also involved large numbers of American at that time conscript troops, that's going to make you unpopular.
Yeah.
So better leave it to the executive branch, which is also empowered by a whole bunch of agencies that are not electorally accountable. So that moves foreign policy from the legislature totally into the executive, where it was split between the legislature and the executive before the 50s. Okay? Once you understand that, you also see this with the empowering of the courts. And people think that it's conservatives who did this. And there's this, there's a lot of, finally, liberals have turned against the Supreme Court. You can go listen to the 5-4 podcast or any of the liberal legal theories in there. But they don't have an alternative legal theory. They're just like, oh, we should have power and empower the administrative state, and it's to save democracy. But neither the judiciary nor the executive agencies are democratically responsive. They both are appointed largely by the fucking president, although at least the judiciary has elements of it appointed by the states and appointed by the Senate. So all this is interesting. But one thing that's really interesting that's been happening that we haven't noticed until now is this tendency, starting with the liberals, who, for whatever reason, knew that if they continued to try to push the Civil Rights Act through legislatively, that they were going to get more and more social unrest, as we saw in the 1960s.
Right. Yeah.
So they allowed the courts to do it. And it created, because it happened at the beginning of the largest and richest generation in American history in aggregate. I'm not talking about individuals here, but we have to understand the post-war boom.
Yeah,
That was taken as normative. So I even heard Marxists say, well, the only progressive legislation that has really happened through the Supreme Court, which is not true, but it is true after about 1965. What has happened since then is in an attempt to check party apparatchiks, but also to make people more accountable, we have done all kinds of things that diffuses power in ways that makes it look like there's voting going on and more public participation, see primaries, but it actually incentivize backdoor activist stuff. So you add that and this judiciary, because the executive also doesn't want to. The executive now has basically been holding the country together increasingly by executive order. This started really under Nixon, but it's increased. I think its highest period is probably Reagan. It was also common during the Clinton administration. But by the time you get to like Bush 2 and Obama and Trump and Biden, you're doing almost everything through executive
What's funny
order.
is that like this seems like the standard position, the assumption. It's kind of like a common sense notion that the president is a figurehead and he doesn't actually do anything. but the executive is actually probably much more significant than it ever was. I mean, certainly than it's supposed to be. But I
Well,
think
here's the
it's
thing.
far more significant than people think it is.
You will have, early bourgeois defenders like our friends at the Platypus Affiliated Society now picking up unitary executive theory as somehow constitutionally valid, as if that wasn't contested within the Constitution historically itself, or as particularly popular in the general public. So, because when you start advocating for the unitary executive, you start arguing that you have three monarchs. Basically, what's going on? Chris Catron argues this in his piece, "Why Not Trump Again," which is his third "Why Not Trump" piece, because that seems to be what he bangs out every 4 years.
I haven't ever read them.
I actually think the first one is defensible. The second one is a little bit eh. The third one, I'm like, you're just making neoconservative arguments, like flat out. I'm not saying that makes them neoconservatives, although at a certain point, how can they not be? And it made me really mad, actually, when I read it, because I'm like, when I left Platypus in 2013, there was a gaggle of them. I don't know if they're still in there even, who attacked me and said I was going to become just another neoconservative. And I was like, what the fuck are you talking about? Like, why would I become a conservative? I was already a conservative. Why would I go back? And I've never liked
those are the only two options. It's either you're in the Platypus Society or you're a neocon. That's it.
Yeah, I guess they meant Democrat, but they don't call me a Democrat anymore. But so there's a push for the unitary executive. There's all these weird hybrid hanger-on groups, and I've been pointing out they're likely to actually achieve some sort of victory, like the alt-right did with Trump, and that will liquidate them.
Right.
Like, but that's happened to, like, people think that I'm just talking about the right wing. That's happened to the DSA, motherfuckers. Y'all did that. Bashkaristan Kara's legacy is not just the centrists who empowered Biden. The left that made a deal with the Democratic Party to engage in a popular front so they could eventually dirty break in some indefinite future time that they never built towards.
And stop talking about.
And moved away from. And also started, while they still maintained their critique of Biden and the centrists, made the exact same structural arguments against people further to the left of them as they were making about Democrats themselves. How can you not see all of these movements, right and or left, as anti-systemic useful idiocy that actually serves some part of the current government? And here's the other thing. We don't really understand. I don't know if we know what parts of the government are actually in charge.
Yeah, I don't think we do either. I also, I know it's not really the point, but I kind of wish we had a separate term, because there's two different things which we always call the Popular Front, and one of them is, I think, worth trying to assess, and one of them is very much not. Like, the Popular Front is the government of East Germany. It's like 5 parties, and they're all, some of them are bourgeois parties, some of them are not, or it's like really the Popular Front is the coalition that defeated the Nazis. And then in the U.S., the Popular Front is just voting for Democrats. It's a separate phenomenon, but it's even called the same thing, even by its proponents. But I just wish I had a different term. I don't know what we would call it.
Well, the thing is,
tailism. It's tailism.
Tailism is what it is.
Yeah.
But the reason why it's tailism is because Popular and United Front strategies are impossible in the United States.
Right.
We're not constitutionally set up for parliamentary coalitions. We're not a parliamentary government. So the importation of European strategies has always meant in America functionally tailism.
Yeah. Okay, that's right.
Right? Like, so, which is why, ironically, third periodism was a disaster for the European left. I think you and I agree with that, even though it's what a lot of the far left wanted, ironically. I mean, it was funny. when I was reading all this Bordiga stuff, I'm like, Stalin did what Bordiga wanted after he kicked Bordiga out of the party, or Bordiga left the party. Like, and then he backtracks on it in the Italian and French case around 36 and the reconstitution of the Italian party in the 40s. And then, but even that's messy because the invention of the Popular Front gets stalled by the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact and then comes back when Hitler attacks. So it led to a total incoherence about the international strategy. But in America, it didn't lead to the Popular Front. Taoism did make the communists more popular, but their high period of effectiveness as an individual entity was actually during the third time period because they worked through unions only. They didn't try to deal with these congressional parties.
Right. That was when all of the anti-lynching and all the early civil rights work was done. That's when all the union drives were done. That's when the heroic period of Browderism, because everyone says Browderism and they think it means liquidation. And that is what it means later. But Browderism also means this other stuff. Like, well, wait, no,
it's William C. Foster that you're really
that's right.
About, I think.
I think you're right. It's William Foster. Browderism is the Popular Front era.
Yeah. But Foster's interesting because Foster is a true Marxist-Leninist, but he starts in the syndicalist tradition and he was part of the Debs campaign. Right. Like, he was part of the pink washing of American history that happened in socialist stuff, which was corrected a little bit in the New Left, and then after the New Left, I think was overcorrected to there was nothing good about any of it ever.
And that's the era we're still in.
Yeah.
But
well, I mean, except the correction is stuff like Maga Communism. I would have said Midwestern Marx, and they're like soft patriotic socialism, but now they're on the Maga Communist train too, and I don't know how they justify that. And they'll say like, "Oh, we don't want the clown, we don't want the clown, we want the burger of Make America Great Again." And I'm like, okay, but what? Like it's a cult of personality around Trump. It's not an independent movement. Like, it's a slogan around one candidate.
I kind of think that the Pop Front era repurposing of the symbols from the American history has some legitimacy, but it's really taken too far by the time you get to the communism is 20th century Americanism. That's insane. But I think that the overcorrection is also insane. And then I think that I didn't even know what we would call it now. It's just everything's just insane. Everyone's insane. That's what it is. So
I realized in doing our series on decadence, and maybe I can tie it in a little bit for our listeners here, because that's why we're calling it Dune 2024. Is that one thing I'll say is there's been a lot of belief in outside parties restoring some kind of multipolar greatness, right?
Yeah.
But that is ignoring the fact that economically speaking, nobody can completely decouple. And if anyone can, it's actually the US. So that's a problem. Like when people talk about these decoupling that's happened, I'm like, but China didn't want that. That was forced on them by the United States. Why do you think? Like, oh, that she's been secretly reading Samir Amin and Arrighi and Wallerstein the whole time. Come on, I'm sure they're familiar. I'm sure she's familiar with it. But that wasn't the strategy. Yes,
I think that's always the hope, is that there's some kind of secret radicalism. It's just not being talked about, but like any minute now they're gonna flip the switch and it's all gonna become.
And they're gonna there's not even a common turn. There's no new Third International. Like, there's no Chinese-led international. There's Chinese geopolitical development, and yes, it's not particularly exploitative compared to the West, and yes, it's not trying to, in general, do gunboat diplomacy. It is still, outsourcing additional labor. It is still Like, there are elements of what we call imperialism in it. It's not just the whole kit and caboodle as understood by the West. And China's very, 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 very responsible with it. Okay, I'm not saying
sure.
against any of that. And I also think the taunt with China is super important. But this idea that they've been, secretly leading a multipolar axis of like secret communist in Russia and in BRICS, that's absurd. And it's harder and harder for people to believe. So one thing that I've seen is like, I've seen in the DSA, a lot of old style Maoism come back. The people who hate China, they're coming, like that kind of Maoist who call China state capitalist are coming back again because they're getting frustrated. Like this Deng thing is not doing what they said. And also China is economically stalling out in this accompanying period. It has more internal capacity right now to eat, some of what's happening to it than the West does. But there are other major problems. It's going to get hit harder by climate change and by food shortage. And it does have, just like the West, a population bomb, but it's so much of a bigger scale just because it's a big country. I mean, like the number of people that we don't know what that means. Like, we don't really understand what it's doing here. Yeah.
I'm curious about, do people actually really, I mean, because I commented on it, but I actually want to investigate this a little bit. Do people actually believe that there's the Chinese strategy is akin in some way to like a Comintern type strategy? Because I think it makes more sense to just take it on its own terms, on the face value, at face value. Like the multipolarity just means freedom of states to do whatever they're going to do, whatever they want to do.
And only large states too. They have to be polar states. Like,
but are there people that actually think that there's more to it than that?
I don't know. I mean, one of the things that we can see is this multipolarity talk spread beyond just Dubin sympathetic circles. Like, and it's being used by people who don't have even necessarily huge sympathies to Russia. But there's something very weird about like MAGA communists who say they're super pro-China, but also are supporting Trump, which is like, okay, you're literally seeing your strategy as supporting the guy who is the most explicit about wanting to undercut China's goals, and whose surrogates and people like Tucker Carlson, or even John Mearsheimer, are pro-Russia to turn Russia away from China to accelerate the China-Russia contradictions and inherent in Eurasianism, to have Russia be neutral or even on our side if there was a hot war.
Yeah, see, I feel like if I was a MAGA communist, I would be very hostile. I mean, any type of left-leaning person at all, I would just be very hostile to any party, to either party. And
well, that was my thing. Is I'm like, well, why aren't you hostile to either party? But when you read, I've recently read, and it's on the Patreon. I'm not putting it into the public, but I recently read word for word the like founding document of Maga Communism, the rise of Maga Communism by the Infrared, which is Haas, and it's all Smith, Dugan, de Benoit, and Heidegger. Heidegger and Smith are and de Maistre. There is some references to Islamism and some references to Marx, but it sees right-wing politics as impossible, but left-wing politics as actually the order of the day and to be destroyed. And all the references are right-wing. They're conservative revolutionaries.
I would respect that more if they just stopped calling it communist and talked about it as some kind of new thing, like Dugin. But I respect that a lot more.
Until Elon reversed the policy on Twitter, I think a lot of this was to get around the fact that if you got called alt-right, you can easily be banned from social media, and social media is how that is these people's strategies. Twitch, and Twitter. Those are the two main goals. They get supported not by Patreon or membership support or anything like that. I've looked at their Patreons; are actually rather small. They get supported by donations through whoever on these streams, so they don't even know who's paying them. They don't know, not really.
Interesting.
So in all this, we have no idea how real or not real any of it is. I'm not willing to say it's unreal either. I'm saying I really cannot tell.
I'm willing to venture a guess, publicly, whatever. That's probably not very real, but I don't know.
Right. I do think I do think some people like around Midwestern marks have gotten themselves in some real cul-de-sacs with this, because stuff like trying to argue that you're significantly different from the Groypers when you have people who are trying to like hang out with Nick Fuentes is going to be hard for them to do.
Right.
But again, in some ways, I think that's all a distraction. Like all these sectarian things are kind of a distraction. It's not to say there's no reality to them, but like, look at what the DSA ended up being.
Right.
It's not that different in its ultimate function. Why you started hearing, Pod Save America pick up DSA talking points was not because anyone was serious about incorporating the DSA's message into the Democratic Party. It was because it gave people, it was a hope grift. It was the same hope grift that Obama did in his first term.
Wait, you don't think it was because the Overton window moved so far left that, I couldn't even make a joke. Yeah.
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 So, I mean, putting that all out there, we have a left that seems to be fragmented, deracinated, and like no one really knows what it means. It is taking more and more radical postures. Trotskyism,
I don't even know what value that has.
Right, but it's postures, like
right.
You and I.
But I will grant what you're saying is true. It's objectively true. So that's
right. I mean, like one thing I will say is like I have been hesitant to like condemn protests, even though I'm normally like protests are a waste of time, because they've had other important downstream effects, and they have made like Palestinians feel like they have some popular support here, because popular opinion is broadly speaking on the Palestinian side, but not a lot. It's a very broad but thin support. So what do I mean by that? Like a lot of people think that what's happening, even a lot of conservatives think that what's happening in Israel and in Gaza and in Palestine is unconscionable. Right.
I mean, even like Piers Morgan recently said that.
Right.
Which really should say a lot. It really should tell you everything you need to know.
Right. Yeah, it's not just like Alex Jones anymore. Like,
yeah. Like it's mainstream conservatism no longer has a stomach for this.
Right. Which is going to be interesting about what Trump does, because Trump has doubled down on his Zionism.
Right.
If Trump is reelected, at this point, given how crazy everything is, I wouldn't be surprised if they're both have heart attacks or something by October. Who fucking knows?
It's very possible. It's not likely, but it's not improbable either.
Right. Well, it's just like I tell people right now that like, okay, let's say they're serious about everything that's in Project 2025, right? And that includes putting America back on the gold standard. Do you think there would not be a coup if they tried that?
No, of course there would be a coup.
Right. And so I'm telling people, like, it is now no longer a non-zero possibility that we have set up the conditions for a coup in which neither party actually wins. Now, is it likely? Absolutely not. I know but the fact that when I mention people to this and they don't go, that's insane, they just go, that's not likely.
Right.
Like that tells you where we're at.
It's plausible now, and it's not at all. It's not likely, sure, but it's not implausible.
I mean, people are talking about Trump being a dictator. I'm like, he won't be a dictator for long. Like, even if he was, like, You don't get long-term dictators in their late 70s. So what is going on? And the other thing that we can definitely say is that Democrats don't really think this is a threat to democracy. And we know they don't really think it's a threat to democracy, not the voters, I mean the people planning, because if they did, they would have already realized they have put Biden in a situation to show how his aphasia has worsened and how incoherent he sounds.
Well, yeah, they would have had a primary.
Right.
That's all. They would have treated it like a threat if it was a threat.
Right. They did not.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, I think you and I have both felt like the entire political spectrum has both seemed more radical and yet somehow more right-wing. And that's hard to explain to people. Like, people go, oh, the youth are super, super progressive. And I'm like, I don't think so. I think they're all over the place. And I think Gen Z, from what I see from Pew polls, is culturally very progressive, yes. But politically, it's gender split in a way that's actually abnormal how different like sex is predicting where people's politics goes. And the vast majority, 70% of Gen Zs don't know shit about politics. And it makes sense. All right? It makes total sense.
I think that the reason why people say stuff like, oh, the youth are very radical and everything is moving left and Gen Z is very progressive is just because you see what you think on social media. So like left-wing millennials see a lot of left-wing Gen Zers. I don't, for two reasons. One is because I don't have TikTok and I don't have Twitter and whatever. And also because I find most left progressive liberal commentary on stuff to be pretty unbearable, which means that I typically actually encounter more of the right-wing leaning Gen Zers because they're not because I'm paying attention to them, but because that's what shows up whenever I like on YouTube and stuff.
Weirdly,
because I watch
get both. So
okay.
it's
right. So then you see it. It's like it's scattered. It's all over the place.
Well, it's because my algorithm is weird. I actually have looked into what Google and Facebook and Meta say I am politically. Because you, at least with Meta, you can find it out, and with Google, you can kind of see it. Google can't figure me out. One of the reasons it can't figure me out is where I live. Right, I live in Salt Lake, which is Gomorrah, but I live in Utah, which is one of the reddest states in the country. So I get Epoch Times ads, and I get Andrew Tate shit, and I get
lots of Andrew Tate shit, yeah,
and I get men's rights stuff, but I also get a lot of feminist stuff, a lot of like progressive Utah stuff from Salt Lake. I get a lot of communist stuff.
The hope is that you're just going to click on something and then you're going to make it clear.
Yeah. Because my demographic reading from them is hard for them to figure out. And I interact with all kinds of people because I also want to still get that stuff, right? The reason why I got back on Twitter was to get people to promote my show because there's so much email terrorism amongst academics. They don't answer their email anymore. And it's like also like people don't pick up their phones anymore because there's so much spam calling and scams.
Well, like in election season, which is like every 2 years, you get like 1 million texts of all kinds. If you've ever read anything that's like any kind of liberal website, you're gonna get texts.
Oh, constantly. I actually also get both Democrat and Republican spam text on my phone because I have registered as both parties as a union organizer to spoil. So I have changed my political registration all the time in Utah, depending on what my union asked me to do for local issues, like which is another thing when people are like, oh, I can look up what party you're registered in. I'm like, that doesn't actually tell you that much anymore. Like people
it doesn't tell you anything at all. Yeah.
I think I'm technically registered as an independent right now, but if you like looked at you're like, wait, he's changed party like 50 times. I'm like, I've had very specific city stuff to do that require me to vote in specific primaries in the city. So my union has asked me to change parties. I also don't think it's very effective, frankly. I mean, it's like people really care about union endorsements, but I'm like, I know very few teachers who vote how the union tells them to vote.
Right.
Like it's even if they're in the union, which is still like union density here is like 10% or something. It's very low. So, and that's it. And I don't mean like in general, I mean specifically in my field, like of Utah teachers who are in the union.
I would guess it's probably higher among teachers than most other professions.
Oh, it is. So for nationally, it's about 69% are unionized. And that's all public schools. But what makes that weird is it's 72% roughly or 73% of teachers in public schools are unionized. In charter schools, it's only 24%. But about a fourth of charter schools are unionized now too. One of the things that I'll say though is there's tensions in the union over this. There's even tensions in the union over what I do. So like since I moved from traditional class into the online classroom, a lot of the union reps don't want to deal with us because they kind of see us as scabs, and I don't know why. So this is one thing when people talk about like. Well, you can tell people have never organized when they make it sound like all these sectors of labor are just kumbaya with each other.
Yeah.
Like when one of the big things when I was talking to the people who went to labor notes this year was getting them to like talk about the fact that like there's a lot of agency nurses who basically scab at union hospitals and also want to be in the union, but they're undermining the very thing that they're trying to help build. And that there's people who are trying to call that out. But how do you do that? Because you also don't want to kick out workers. Like, and given some of the work conditions, going agency made a lot of sense for a lot of people.
Oh yeah, like I mean, I know several nurses who have done that, who've gone that route, and then they'll even say like, "I wish I had a different choice. Like, I would like to be a stable union nurse in one place, but it's not feasible." So what do you do with that?
Yeah, I mean, this is where Sean and I come into different. Like Sean has telling me like, "Oh, it's better not to care about all this," and I'm like, just be like, no.
I think you have to. I think you have to. It sucks to care about it, but you have to.
Like the idea that you can just go on doing your parastate organization, your pre-political stuff without dealing with politics as is, and I'm not sure that's what Sean was suggesting when he said that on Twitter recently, but I was like, that's not smart, actually. If that's what you mean, I wish he was here, actually. We would have talked about it. But
well, actually, if he was here, we would be talking about Dubin. So
yeah, that's true. And I'd be setting up a time to talk to him about it. And I probably still will. But one of the things that I want people to look at is it was weird. I had this anarchist really go at me on Twitter, and it's always stupid to talk about Twitter debates. But it was weird because they're like, well, what are you going to talk about? How decadent the system is? Like, yeah. And they're like, well, people of color and a lot of the working class aren't registered, don't register the vote anyway, or they don't vote when they can. And I'm like, yeah, I know that. I've been saying that for 10 years. Like the stats about who the working class vote for are always like ignoring the fact that the quote working class as defined by liberals. So the poor working class really.
right.
Does not vote, and a lot of people of color don't vote because of run-ins with the law in states that prohibit felons from ever getting a voting right back, or because they don't believe in the system in the first place. And why would you blame them? Like, but I wasn't covering this because I want people to vote for Biden or Trump. I'm covering this because in some ways, and this is not for the workers or for the working poor, in some ways, a lot of people who are in intermediate positions, white collar labor, low level management, etc., have been very deluded about where they are politically, and their first response when they run into this is either to say, oh, well, no one knows how politics is going to go. You don't have a degree in political science. First of all, don't fucking listen to anyone with a degree in political science in the first place.
I was going to say that's the surest sign that you should never listen to somebody, is if they have a degree in political science.
Right. I mean, like, there are some people who have it. I mean, like, I read it, but like those people tend to overgeneralize and assume priors and all kinds of stuff. But the other thing...
Sorry.
Go ahead.
Driver is 5 minutes away.
Okay, all right.
Yeah.
So I think we are in a weirder situation right now. So, you know, the other thing that's commonly posited is that you hear the people who every 4 years threaten to leave the country. And it is easier.
Yeah.
I mean, right now, Mexico City is like the District Federal is like really responding to like being overrun with telecommuters who really like Mexico City. And like, I like Mexico City too, but I wouldn't live there because I don't want to like, I don't want to, you know, what I like about Mexico is not being around.
Well, right. Like, I do know some people who
expats.
I do know some people who have done that though. And I know some other people who have talked about doing that and like asked me to join them, and like I said no, and the reason why is because I've lived in a foreign country before, and like I don't want to do that. For better or for worse, this is where I live, this is where I'm from, you know.
Yeah, I've talked to someone about that too, because people keep asking me if I think about going back abroad, and I'm like, where would I go? What do you think you can outrun this decadence? Like,
that's the thing about capitalism, is it's global.
Right. Like, sure. But do you see what's happening in France right now? Do you see what's happening in the UK? Even with Labor, you know, even with Labor geared to pick up seats, and, you know, what are they going to do? They're going to try to reduce the deficit. They're going to try to impose fiscal austerity. They're going to pick up the same policies on trans people that the Tories are. Like, there's literally...
Yes. Starmer is like a Blairite, but like without any charisma and also any vision and without any connection to a recent radical past. So he's like a Blairite, but we raised by a generation of Blairites.
Right. So, I mean, you're now dealing with the second, third generation of that.
Right.
People are trying to save Corbyn's seat. So there's that. But...
Okay. Damn. Hang on 1 second. Sorry.
No problem. Okay. So, I mean, in the long array of things, we have a lot of major problems right now. Things are heating up with NATO and Europe. Even discussions of sending troops in, which I have no idea how real to take that now. It seems like you have a situation where Zelensky is basically saying they'll wage war until they get Crimea back, which I guess that means to the last Ukrainian is dead. I have no idea. That seems...
Yeah, I mean, that just sounds like total rhetoric. There's no way that's possible. It's empty rhetoric.
Well, another issue that you have is like, well, when people talk about like, oh, we have, you know, what if we descend into war as a way to fix these global problems? And I'm like, you'd have to redo the entire command chain. I mean, the whole sea power basis of U.S. power is hitting limits because they don't command boots on the ground or long command chains. They want to do everything by outsourcing neoliberally. And that's really expensive. And they also don't want to do anything but with drones and bombs. So, you know, it makes Peter Zion look right that basically the expense of the way we do things is leading the Hadrian's Wallification of parts, and people are just like, you know what, maybe it's not worth it to have Red Sea trade. Fuck it. Like, and that's a weird, like place to be. I mean, it's not like the Houthis, and when people are like, oh, Yemen, I'm like, well, there's been a civil war in Yemen going on, I don't know, 15 fucking years now. Like,
it's almost 20 years, actually.
Yeah, it's been a very long time. It predates the Syrian civil war, which has only recently kind of been settled when people stopped using Syria as a pincushion for whatever they want to, for bombs, for whatever they want to like do in the Middle East. Like Erdogan versus Iran versus Saudi doing local bullshit with you, versus Qatar doing local bullshit with each other there.
And I think there's still U.S. troops there for some reason.
Mm-hmm. So who knows?
Yeah.
The idea that the American military apparatus is devolving is not true. While America doesn't seem to be economically all that interested in Africa, seems to be totally willing to let that be parceled up between France and China. Militarily, we're seeing an expansion of military bases there.
Well, and Russia.
Yeah, and Russia's all over it too. Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, that's what the Wagner group cut its teeth on, is shenanigans in North Africa and in Syria.
Yeah.
So, and I mean, yes, that's gone. I mean, me getting a feel for how like the neoliberalization and weird sub parts of the army, like all that stuff has been like, oh, you have quasi independent army. Well, that's a bad idea. But what we've seen is Russia, because it maintained its heavy industrial capacity, and we were talking a little bit off air, is able to move back to Clausewitzian level artillery production. However, the sanctions have forced the Russian consumer goods economy to finally do what Brezhnev didn't do, despite Khrushchev wanting it to happen, which was to actually start producing a regular goods economy in Russia, which raised the Russian wage. So there is a real sense that sanctions backfired. They did hurt Russia, and I think the idea that it didn't hurt Russia at all is actually false. But
I mean, it hurt them a little bit for a while, but it was a while ago.
It forced them to deal with it internally. Now, there will be a limit to that growth, right?
Well, yeah. Same as in China. Like, they had some very serious growth because of internal changes for a while, and that seems to maybe have slowed down kind of a lot even.
Well, I mean, it is interesting to listen to people. Like, I remember China skeptics in the aughts and early teens saying if China ever went below like 13% GDP, the country would collapse. It's now down to like 4 and 5% GDP growth.
Yeah. China's not going to collapse. I mean, it's going to have booms and busts like any normal country, but it's not going to go anywhere.
It's in a kind of bust period, and it's about to have a major demographic shift, as we mentioned earlier. That's real.
Yeah.
But so are we. Like, meanwhile, the places that are getting heated up all on the equator are all having population bombs. I was like talking to my partner, and we were talking about like Gen Z, and I'm like, in the developed world, even in the developed Asian world, in the semi-periphery, as the world systems people like to say, we are experiencing massive population bombs where they're just declining. So people I don't mean the population is going to explode as an outward. I mean the population is going to implode.
Yeah, it's like a black hole,
right?
More than a bomb. It's like it's going to go.
Yeah. But the want of immigration in most of these countries is bad enough that even parties that have traditionally been pro-immigration have maintained anti-immigrant policies.
Well, like we were just talking about labor.
Right.
Labor in the UK is precisely one such party.
Right. So We are also at the point where Macron's unpopularity and the attempt at a new popular front in France, and this is an actual popular front in the old sense of the word, not the American tailist version, has formed. But it looks like that still may end up with Le Pen in charge or in coalition with the Macron government.
Yeah, I feel like I don't remember what the guy's name is. It's like it's Le Pen's party, but it's not going to be Le Pen.
No.
But it's like whatever his name is the most likely new prime minister. And a big part of the reason for that is that there's always this weird Trotskyist group, Lutovier, which will never sign on to any kind of coalition of any sort with any other left-wing group. And they'll be like, I think they'll be like the French, like the Greek Communist Party. Like they should be remembered as criminally negligent, if they're remembered at all. But I don't know. Whatever, we'll see.
We'll see. I mean,
it's probably not going to be good for. And it's more than likely it's going to be a very hard right government in France.
We've seen a left turn in Mexico, kind of with Steinbaum, although in the case of massively increased involvement of the cartels and politics, which is concerning. We've seen the pink wave. I mean, how many fucking pink waves have I been told about that's just washed up on the shores of history?
I mean, like
at least 4, 3, like
3 or 4, yeah.
Like it's just like Peru, Argentina, like the left Peronis, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, like it's just kind of ridiculous at this point. Lula, I mean, even though for about 30 seconds it looked like Venezuela was going to go to war with a very rich subdeveloped that also has a left-wing government that was going to be protected by Brazil, so you might literally have like Lula and Maduro at war with each other. That didn't happen. Luckily, the Maduro didn't go that route. Yeah, but it's been funny how this is going, and people, of course, aren't listening to what Venezuelan communists and socialists are saying, because they're also like, this government is not. We're having harder time supporting it. So who knows how the elections are going to go there? They're coming up.
They're actually coming up exactly 1 month from now, right?
Right. We almost had a coup in Bolivia, and the MAS movement seems to be an internal civil war. Like not a hot war, but like one side of Morales's party is accusing the other side of Morales's party is instigating the coup.
Right.
So this is like things aren't good, right? And the problem that we have in left media is the same problem we have in media in general. People pick this shit up when it looks good, and they drop it the moment it doesn't.
Yeah.
And so we don't get reports on it.
Yeah, like you could be really excited for a moment, and then like changes, and you don't hear about it anymore. And it's just like it happens overnight. So you can't ever like follow a through line unless you just independently just investigate yourself. That means you have to be like an obsessive nerd about one thing, because you have to pick up wherever we left off.
And it's hard, like in South America, like how do I follow all the governments in South America? I don't even read all the languages I'd need to read to do that, right? Because I'd need to read like some indigenous languages. I do read Spanish, so I can follow some of those, but I'd also need to read French and Portuguese.
And Portuguese, yeah.
And I mean, I read English, so I can follow what goes on in Belize. Like,
that's funny. I always forget about Belize.
But nonetheless, I mean, like, this is very hard to keep up with. And I feel like people follow Europe a little closer, but it's mostly like the SPD Green Alliance in Germany has mostly been a disaster.
Oh yeah, definitely.
Like it has made the Christian Democratic rule look pretty good. Like And that means that the ADF is going to get more and more popular, particularly in East Germany. Ironically, given the way everything's played out. Who know? I can't figure out what's going on in Italy and in. I mean, yes, we have Maloney. You have these kind of like, you know, anti-EU populists in Maloney and Orban, but they're pretty much already reconciled to the common order.
Oh yeah, totally. Especially Maloney, like almost overnight. And I also kind of think that's what I'm just gonna say Le Pen, because people are gonna know what I mean. That's kind of what's gonna happen in France too. Like I know there's the Front National was founded by people who were served in the Waffen SS, but the Front National is a Republican party. They're not going to overthrow the Republic. They have no pretensions of doing so. They have no aspirations of doing so. They don't talk bad about the concept of democracy. They're just going to be intolerant of immigrants. And it's going to be bad, but it's going to still just be a regular old neoliberalism.
Yeah. I mean, it's going to be interesting. Is it Jordan Bardella?
That's the one. Yeah.
Or Jordin Bardella. I don't know. It doesn't actually look like a French name, ironically. So
that being said, I think that I want to probably we'll have to revisit this at some point, because there's always the outside chance that there's some kind of, the new Popular Front might be able to pull some votes from Macron's people, and then who knows what will happen.
Yeah,
that's actually kind of interesting to think about.
I mean, well, does this work out differently than how it worked for Syriza or for Podemos?
Right. That's a good question. Yeah.
I don't know.
It's probably not a good idea to say it will work out differently. This maybe not.
I don't think it's also yet we can say it's going to work out the same either, but the track record isn't good on left coalitionary Popular Front populist in Europe in the last 15 years. All the
Portugal is the Bloco de Izquierda. Yeah. Basically every country, including Germany, which had Die Linke. They never took power, but they rose and fell pretty quickly.
Yeah, we've seen this happen very fast.
Yeah.
Whereas these right-wing movements have been pretty steady. Some of the most extreme ones, like Golden Dawn or Casa Pound, or borderline paramilitary groups, those sort of things, they have come and gone. But their more mainstream counterparts have not only maintained, but they've actually increasingly integrated themselves into the social order. So it's not like you're getting what, for example, Dubin in 2014 was predicting, these national Bolsheviks balkanizations of Europe. It's more like you're just getting a slightly meaner, slightly more Bonapartist Europe, which is also why I'm going, where do you think you're going to go, liberals, when they're like, we're going to run away? And I'm like, okay, where? Mexico? That's historically not a place you guys have wanted to go, but okay. Because it looks like we're about to see Trudeau ousted in Canada too. I mean, he's been in charge for a long fucking time and has very little to show for it. And is more, and you know what is amazing? When you look at the centrists who are in charge of major powers, we have to admit, Biden is probably the most unpopular American president since Trump, who was the most unpopular American president since Herbert Hoover.
Which is actually saying something, yeah.
Right. But I mean, literally, as I said yesterday, one of my mini dictats about this was we're literally watching the most unpopular president fight with the last most unpopular president about who's going to be remembered as the second most unpopular president in U.S. history, unless stuff really, really changes in ways that don't seem likely. But the political milieu seems so exhausted. I mean, this is where this decadence theory that I'm playing with is really important because, one, we talked about these demographic changes. Gen Z is a small generation, people. Right now, the largest age cohort is millennial. And millennial is increasingly dividing between centrist and progressives and people who are becoming right wing in their late 30s, early 40s, which is later than historical happens. But a lot of people finally got wealth because the boomers died. We can't blame the geriatric boomers in charge just on the boomers because millennials have been unsuccessful at deseating them and have been voting for them.
Right.
Factually, there's no way around that. That's just the way the demographics fall. We've also seen a massive decline in and like we've seen a big population decline and the working population decline too because childcare is too expensive. So like I know a lot of women who are now stay-at-home moms because they literally cannot afford to work because they would make like $5,000 more than it would cost to have their kids watched. So why bother?
Yeah.
Like, I mean, if you're a single woman,
Because there's no trade-off there. Like,
right.
If it'd be one thing if you like, you wouldn't have that time with your kid, but also you would make money, and so like you could make some calculations and whatever. But that amount is not enough to justify what you would be giving up to go to work.
Right. So you have a lot of more so that's where some of the decline in the working population went. I mean, one of the things that people miss when people talk about like the Fed's attempt to raise interest rates, the traditional Fed justification was based on two things. One, a variable interest mortgage, which we got rid of in the United States a long time ago. 90% of mortgages are fixed because if you think things are bad now, like what would happen if you have, some of these massive houses have their interest rate go up from year to year? Like it would be, you would have another 2007. So between the reforms on the subprime industry and also going all the way back to New Deal, traditionally pushing against variable rate loans, which are actually more common in Europe, raising interest rates has less of an effect. But what it does do is create massive wealth gaps and like arbitrary wealth gaps, like just based on when you entered the housing market. There's no like, it's a totally speculative market. But the other thing is that they thought that would lead to increased savings, and it doesn't, because no one has the extra resources to really save. I mean, you have to make a ton of money to not, because the list of needs of modern life has just increased. Like, what are you expected to have? Well, you need internet to get work. So like, you can't forgo that. You can't forgo car insurance. You can't forgo health insurance.
You have to have a new computer. It's like a new computer every, I don't know.
I mean, they've gotten better. I don't know. I keep my computers up for like 5 or 6 years now because there's less and less innovation there. That's all on phones. But you need a new phone every 2 to 4 years.
Oh yeah. Okay. That's right.
So so your list of necessities has changed. There is now a trend that I find worrying of people like claiming like, oh, you need to make $120,000 to be comfortable. I'm like, yeah, that's kind of bullshit. But like, you do need to make more than 50 now. Like,
oh yeah.
I mean, so where are you at? Like, well, the average income in the United States per individual is about $48,000, I believe. For household, it's about 80. But household, the reason why we should look at the individual and not the households vary in size.
Right.
So I mean, the whole thing's a mess right now. Our public institutions are really fucked, and we're not dealing with it. Healthcare totally off the fucking rails, and Biden has been administering healthcare austerity through the back door by lowering payouts this entire time after COVID. There's been no talk, none of any significant healthcare reform, none. All right, and we all know that Obama admitted there was a bomb. There were several bombs in the Affordable Care Act, and that they were never fixed. So there's that. We see the school system is in fucking free fall. Truancy is now like at 20%.
Is that really that high?
Yes.
Wow. Jesus.
I
guess that's something I never really paid much attention to, but
most leftists don't have kids.
Yeah, and you have to because
I'm a teacher.
Yeah.
Which is not to say it's all bad. There is good stuff going on in education, particularly in inner city education. I don't want people to make it sound like I'm super dire, but the literacy scores are bad, even now at fairly elite public schools.
Well, yeah.
Like, what's happening now is it's just moving from like they get the best resources to just outright nepotism. Like, and ironically, and Freddie DeBoer is wrong about many, many things. He kind of, but he's right about this, that a lot of the way that we have handled the biases in testing is by going to things that are actually more biased, like holistic evaluation. You know what that ends up being? I'm going to look at your zip code.
Right.
And we've seen a decline in economic diversity in colleges. But we shouldn't be surprised by that, as has come out in these Palestine things. What are the colleges? None of the colleges even make that much money off of their fucking undergrad programs. They make money off of their being landlords, off of the fact most of them run hospitals and have hospital systems and are thus benefiting from the hospital dysfunction as well.
Well, and also just have big investment portfolios.
Oh, yeah. So if you look at their revenues, usually about like, less than a fifth comes from actual teaching.
Right. They're barely schools.
Right. Now that's not that's true in the US. It's less true in Britain, but it's true in Britain. Now the rest of the world, public schools are basically pay in, pay out model. They have, like that's how they work. But
for now, yeah.
I don't know. I mean, I think it's becoming clear that it's not this way of making money is really volatile. That particular form of rent seeking is really volatile, and having the university serve that many functions is a problem. Which is why I even like floated kind of ironically that in the great madness of Trump, that if he'd have thought about it, he may have done like a total loan forgiveness and also killed the federal student loan program. Like, I'm going to forgive it, but I'm going to fix the problem by ending the program.
Right.
Which also is going to hurt a lot of Democrats' base. Right. And I was surprised that he didn't actually do that, to be quite frank.
Well, he would have to have very coherent, far-reaching foresight. He'd have to have actual politics.
Yeah. Well, the thing is,
he just doesn't have it. He's just whatever. Yeah, whatever. He just doesn't have politics.
There's a tendency right now on the left, because everything feels like it's moving rightward, for people to say, "Oh, well, the right's coherent right now." No, it's not.
Yeah, not at all.
We see that in Congress. We see that in the way that the right doesn't agree on what the states are doing. We see that on the fact on attempts to build a legacy beyond Trump himself, even the competitor legislature of someone like DeSantis was rapidly unpopular when she got out of Florida.
Well, and like, what was his name? Vivek Ramaswamy. Like, yeah, his main thing was that he was a very pro-Trump guy. I was like, well, then why are you running then?
Because Trump's also going to not reward him for being the pro-Trump guy who is also competing against him. So, like, there's this is a politics of a pseudo-Bonapartism. But I say pseudo to go back to what we were talking about in the beginning. because increasingly the right is ruling by the judiciary. And the left's attempts to like deal with that is to like press on the margins, but they refuse to do things like court packing, which is the only real option they have, because everything else they'd have to do would require an amendment to the Constitution, and good fucking luck on that. But they won't do it, right? Because they know it's going to instigate a red cream game. But the red cream game's already begun,
Right.
Like in some ways, we're in a very weird moment where you have a Bonapartist-like movement that isn't relying on the military, but relying on the judiciary and parts of the police. That's bizarre. I can't think of anything like that historically.
I was going to say it's kind of like it's Bonapartist, but only because we have no better word for it.
Right.
It really it needs its own term.
Well, I don't know what it's not really like. Yes, I guess they're hoping that the judiciary will empower them with a unitary executive, but there's a limited, like the right-wing judiciary has actually been limitedly, been limited on how far to follow either the right-wing activists beyond, like yes, Alito and Clarence Thomas are going to do their thing, but the majority of the courts, like we're not going to support like a judicial federal abortion ban or even ban abortifacient drugs or whatever. We're not going to do that, not by judicial fiat. And we're willing to let the law become incoherent, right? But we're not willing to totally double down on like unitary executive theory. But we're also not. I mean, and look, let's be quite frank. I want to say this because everyone's like, "Oh, Trump is a felon," and he probably is a felon 1,000 times over. But that's not my point.
Yeah.
When I actually looked at the details of the New York case, it is weird. It's very strange. Literally, no one has been tried the way that they tried Trump for this, so that hush money paying out moved from a misdemeanor to a felony. And it will probably be reversed in the appellate courts in July.
Oh, yeah, almost certainly.
Like, so that's bizarre. And while, the election tampering stuff, there's more there, but even then you're dealing with novel stuff that we haven't actually dealt with at this level in prosecution before. Literally the law is being made by the case law around this. Right. This is not old settled law that's being pointed out, and people don't know that. Which is not to say that Trump is innocent. It just isn't like. In fact, guilt or innocence is kind of irrelevant here.
Right.
It is weird, and I just felt like I have been like, okay, but if you guys were going to do this, why did you not do this in the first? Why did it take you 4 years to build these weird legal cases? If this would have been easy.
It's almost like they just don't know what they're doing, like at all. Oh, you know what else? It's just going to mess up recording or whatever. It's almost 9 o'clock.
On that note, I think we have ranted enough. This has been a kind of sporadic and all over the place project Doom 2024 special, but we'll have more throughout the year. I think my last note is, I do think decadence actually does present. I don't want people to think that like we're just pessimists. There is a dialecticalness where like there is opportunity here. The great chaos under heaven thing, like never let a crisis go to waste. But use whatever quote you want to, Chairman Mao, Mount Pelerin Society, whatever. But
that opportunity is going to look different than what we would expect if we're being optimists about it.
Right. I think right now it's like when people go, well, why don't you vote for a third party? I'm like, you would have needed to build a serious third party starting from really, if I'm going to be really fair, from at least 2016 onward. And we did the opposite.
Yeah.
Right.
We actually did the precise opposite at the only time during our lifetimes
when it was viable,
when we actually could have done something else.
Right. And that is going to haunt us for a long time. I don't like the other thing I think we have to look at is there are reasons to be excited about labor, but the idea that we're on the precipice of a massive relaborization of like those left-wing talking points over the past 4 years have been by and large, frankly, not just wrong, but like horribly wrong.
Like delusionally wrong, yeah.
Like misrecognizing that, like, oh, yeah, if the service sector is unionizing, even if it's a small part, there's such small shops that it's going to look like you have a threefold increase in unions, but you actually don't. Like,
yeah.
And you're not like, and you're only dealing with corporatized Starbucks. You're not even dealing with franchises or whatever, because you still haven't figured that out. And there's more franchise things than there is corporate things. I don't know what people are thinking. The UAW is doing great stuff. I got pushback for saying that Sean Fain kissed Biden's ring. I think he was being strategic. We also see the Teamsters trying to be strategic, but pissing the left off because they're making forays to both parties. Which, frankly, why shouldn't they?
Yeah.
Like, everybody, the entire rest of the lobbying spectrum and of associations, including progressive NGOs, do often play both sides. Why would you expect unions to be the only captured party? Like, and why, when you admitted that the period of union lobbying that went on from the 80s until the middle aughts was a disaster for the labor movement? And they got nothing from the Democrats for it. Nothing. Like, they only started getting stuff because of Biden's administrative decisions around the National Labor Relations Board. But even that now risks the Supreme Court coming down on it like a hammer.
Yeah.
So, I don't know. So, yes, there's opportunity. Yes, don't fall into despair. But also don't lie to yourself, man. Like, this is a bad time. This is and it is, you and I for now 4 years have been saying this is a worse time than people feel like, and now it feels like it took the stupid fucking debate for it to finally hit a bunch of people.
Yeah.
It really is worse than you felt like, and you really did mess up in 2019. And what I think a lot of people have intuited that, and what they've just done is like, well, maybe we can tell the right and get them to become more communist because they no longer sound as positive of neoliberalism. I'm like, that's stupid. We have tried it before. It doesn't work.
Nope, it doesn't work at all.
Like, you're either independent or you're a strong ally that can control, that can actually, have an effect in a coalition, or you're superfluous. And all this talk about, like, the real movement out there in the streets, where is it?
I mean, the real being very generous about what we might call real movement, at least it's still been a few years since there has been any movement on the streets. And that's being very generous. I would say it's been, it's been a very, very long time. I'm not going to put a year on it. It's just, it's been a very long time. It's a phantom is what people are talking about, a phantom.
We saw it almost start in 2020 and then immediately subsumed itself in the Biden election campaign.
Right.
Like, which is what I was afraid of, frankly. So anyway, you need to go. I need to go. We're only going to bum our audience out.
Yeah.
I don't normally do like the pundit political commentary thing. This year is an election year, and I feel like I'm being dragged not by other people, not even by my audience, but just being like, I don't even want to gloat about this because I think it's actually weirder and worse than I thought, but we need to explore how we got here. Like, and someone needs to really deal with how we got here. And I don't know that I know all the answers to that. Like, I want people to know, like, I don't think I have the magic bullet for this. But unless we really ask that, we can cosplay all we want on Twitter. We can even cosplay and protest. But we're not going to achieve much.
We're not going to achieve anything. Not on that basis.
Or we might actually achieve things that are bad. Like,
well, yeah, I mean, because that we have done in spades lately for the last decade or 20 or 30 years even.
Yeah, I mean, it's amazing to me when you look at the stats how little the Gen X and millennial left has accomplished in 30 years. Like, and that is despite the Overton window and the general culture moving from we don't exist to, oh, you know, people now pick up left-wing identities in high school because it's cool. Like, and because they're afraid, you know, and they're right to be. I mean, and if the fact that you think that the Democrats are secretly trying to pull a stunt and that they realize how bad they fucked up, their electorate does, but they don't know what to do about it. It's already too late.
Yeah.
All right. Well, on that note, happy Doom 2024. Bye-bye.